Now we turn a bit more to the consumer, what's happening with jobs, and where do people feel and what are they going to go about and spend. And before we get further into that, we'd like to remind you, please like, share, subscribe. Any of your comments would be interesting, especially on this. How are you spending? Are you spending more? Are you spending less? My wife and I, we were watching I don't know, some show, and there was people were at a bar. And she said to me, she's like, I look at this knowing it's fake and I get nervous. Like I look at this and I'm concerned about, will I feel comfortable? And like, I'm getting nervous for them about, you're in a crowd. That seems pretty close. And I think that given I'm talking about her, but I don't think she's the abnorm. Like when I look and hear about my other friends, her friends, they're all in that same boat. And then when you look at this chart here and look at how soon from now would you feel comfortable, there's clearly a shifting paradigm of away from the near term and into the longer term. And I think that takes more and more time. And when I think back to what she said, I look at attending a large public event. That's a bar. That's, something that's large. There's all of these people around you that you don't know. And you can see that shifting to the right, where 4% would do it in now or under a month, a little bit more in 2 to 5 months, and then 58% in 6+ months. And I think that is a bigger, she isn't the abnorm. I think she's more of the normal when we look at those shifting moves, like going on vacation. Like some people feel a little bit better, but 51%, there's still more than half of the people are like, I'm not traveling for the next 6 months. And then eating out at restaurants is kind of fairly flattish, down 6%, just because do you want to eat outside in the cold, or will you wait till things get a little bit better? Shopping in stores, I think, when I picking on my wife again, she has normalized a bit with going to Target and some of the other stores where before it was more for me versus I would go, she would stay home, and now she's going out a bit more with my youngest, and I think that is a certain, the first step. Like if you think about a 12-step process of getting to attending a large public event, that is step one. And I think a lot of people, or at least others, as more and more are comfortable wearing masks, you see more people being appreciative of space. That is one thing. But going back to work, among workers, you continue to see that move lower, where 57% say they would now or under a month, and more are saying, look, give it 2 to 5, 6 months. And I think that is going to continue to shift. So again, this is where we continue to see these movements in what people are willing to do. But when you think about how are people shifting, it's how money from retirement account distribution is people took loans. Well, what were the loans taken for? Living expenses was 63%. So people were borrowing against retirement to pay medical bills, living expenses, home repairs. These are issues over time when we consider, because this has to be, or technically has to be paid back, or you have to recognize it as a distribution. So if you don't recognize it as a distribution, and if you that means you pay yourself back at a fixed rate, which again will take away from your near-term spending. It'll save for retirement, but again, it's going to pivot how you're going to spend your discretionary cash, and that cash coming in on wages, you're going to pay yourself back, or you'll take a distribution, pay a penalty, because if you do it before a certain age, you have to pay a penalty on it, which, that should be waived given that these are extenuating circumstances. But again, these are things that have to be looked at when we're considering how quickly will we get some normalcy in the way the consumer is spending. And this is one of those hidden places where people are going to turn around and pay themselves back instead of trying to go out and do more with their capital. And when we look at the average hours per worker, so this is, I think, we're seeing less employees, but the average paid hours per worker essentially going back to normal. So they're doing more with less. Now, if we increase the minimum wage, not to say that we should or shouldn't, you have to consider that that's going to increase the cost of employees. So will you see companies say, look, it's now $15, fine. My prices in the store are going to go up, or I'm going to let go 1.5 employees. Now these, or maybe a mixture of both. Instead of 1.5, I'll let go of one employee and I will increase costs a little bit and that will offset. So I'll keep half of an employee. These are things to think about as we go through. What does inflation look like? How much will that drive up prices? Will that hinder the recovery of employment as people recognize that as a cost, and because of that cost, they hire less people? And this is this conundrum that we sit in of how do we get people back in the workforce with less, more places going bankrupt, more places shuttering permanently, and just companies now doing more with less. And when we look at small business employment, this is, again, we're down another 4.2%. In December, you can see this trend of just small business employment going lower, and it's coming back to people doing more with less. As they try to get back to profitability, they try to kind of normalize where they can find some sort of semblance of normalcy. And that's why I think this jobs recovery, which, as we've talked about, how the actual is right in this dip right here, and then there's the forecast is that things are going to start to get better, and again it's gradual. I just think that there's going to be a bit more of a rollover when we go into not only just January but February and March. And then as we get out of Q1, I think you could start to see some normalcy, because I think March is going to be a tough month for COVID. And then you might say, why do you say that? Well, when we look at March and season changes in general, that's when people are more prone to getting sick during these season changes. And I don't think this one's going to be any different when we consider COVID and where we were last March, given there's going to be more people that have already been sick, more antibodies, more vaccinations out there. So I don't know how bad that will look, but I think there is something to be expected in March that would start to limit some of that activity. And I think once we get into June and beyond and start to get into summer, we can start to hopefully see some of that acceleration on the jobs front. But when we look at the jobless rates and what is the expectation, the rate was 6.7% in December and 3.6% in December of 19. And this is where those expectations are. And when I look at Oxford Economics, and I'm much closer to 6% than not. When you start to take away and start to factor in some key components of, well, what is the unemployment rate? Well, the unemployment rate is we continue to see less people in the actual pool because there's disgruntled or people that are discouraged and they're not looking for a job, so they're not counted. So I think as you start to see things get better, people re-enter looking for a job, which will keep this elevated over the next couple of quarters, and will be between that 5 and 6% over, which, I mean, obviously you can see that most of the analysts are there. I just think that closer to 6% versus 5.5% is very likely, especially when we start to look at home-based client firms percent change. You can see that, again, the holidays were here. We're still not getting back to where we were, and we've showed this before. We're just going to highlight it again. We're just not getting to the snapback, and every time this trend, and it's because people may have shut down going into year end saying, look, it was a tough year of 2020. We didn't make it. We tried. Or now they're in 2021. They're looking at the budget and they're saying, without more help, we're not going to make it. And they're just looking to do less, or they're already shut down or stayed shut down, which is, again, the overarching problem. And this is the change in employees working, where when we look at what has happened in 2019, 2020, same thing. We're just not getting that snapback in terms of coming out of the holidays and seeing those hours coming, because there's just less people doing work. And if you do have a company, you're doing it with less employees. Which, when we look at local business and restaurants, so this is looking at Yelp data. So Yelp is showing that permanent closures continue to rise, but the temporary have also risen. So temporary is kind of flattened out. It went strong where temporary went down, permanent went up. But now we're seeing both of them starting to shift up into the new year, with the total just continuing to go. And this is obviously number of restaurants going to that 160,000. And it's the unfortunate thing because I think this winter is going to be tough for many that aren't able to have outdoor dining. And this is going to weigh on just those permanent closures where you're going to get that shift, and more permanents will happen over the coming months. So this is looking at JOLTS, which is something to consider in terms of job openings. This is through November, and you can see that the job openings, as we've been talking about, have continued to trend to the downside, which we've obviously been highlighting using Indeed data, using some of the other job sites. And this is where, again, this is why we have this confidence, or at least near-term confidence, that we're not going to get this snapback in activity, and we're going to have this this slowdown in terms of what people are capable of doing or what jobs are actually available in the market. Which is why when we look at net change, we had down 140,000 in the employment change, and this is looking at the non-farm payrolls, and you could see just where the pressure remains. Leisure, service, total private, total non-farm. We had some increases, but again, the trend remains down, and this gives you the leaders and laggards. So apparel, obviously courier messengers continue to explode to the upside. Got a little bit of a gain in petroleum, coal, just energy in general. But you can see that we're still well off of where we started, with food and services rolling over, leisure, scenic, arts and entertainment, amusement, and all of these bottom ones are going to continue to get worse. Obviously, there's seasonality attached to it, and the seasonality is just going to exacerbate those issues. But even some of the ones that have benefited, we're still not back to where we were, and based on apparel and some of the new closures, some of the slowdowns, and just in terms of energy demand, those are going to remain a much bigger issue, which when we break it down and look at what is the downturn done, 27 million workers hit by the COVID downturn. And this gives you the backdrop of who? 10.7 million officially unemployed, 3.7 million unemployed but misclassified as employed or not in the labor force. Again, kind of that fudge, that number that can adjust. 4.9 million dropped out of the labor force. That is the number that will start to creep back, where they go from out of the labor force back into the labor force, which will keep that unemployment rate elevated. And 7.5 million employed but experiencing a cut in pay. That is the underemployment number. Again, this is a huge piece of the buying power of the U.S. economy that is impacted and will now do less with their capital. And we saw that show up in shopping. So when we look at the last, turning backwards and looking at how did people spend, you can see Black Friday was down 55%, Super Saturday down 40%, day after Christmas down 35%, second Saturday in December 40%, day before Christmas Eve 40%. We're seeing a huge, now this is bricks and mortar. This is not including what people purchased online instead of going in stores. But again, coming back to how are people adjusting? They're not driving to the store. They're either not going at all and they're not buying anything, or they're buying online. All of these things are shifting the global or the U.S. pattern of purchasing. And we're not alone. This is a global shift where people are doing less in store, more online, more e-commerce, limiting exposures, but also changing the spending patterns. Gasoline demand, diesel demand are very much a big shift and a big part of this. But we're also seeing less, as we talked about last week and the week before. We did see a reduction in what people bought for the holidays, and that's just coming back to who has a job, who doesn't, or who has taken a cut in pay. Then when we look at household consumption of goods, this is the same thing. We're seeing this drop in just the consumption of goods back from, and this is looking at that not just in the U.S. This is looking in Germany and just what is happening in Europe in general. And we'll talk about that more in the next segment, but we're just showing you right now that it's not just a U.S. issue. The retail consumer, the consumer in general, the retail spending is going down in Europe as well, and it's not going to adjust anytime soon. So here when we look at, where are people sitting on food? We have been very adamant about the issues with food, the problems with food security. Here is a new update where nearly 1 in 5 adults with children household lacks sufficient food in the last 7 days. Now we're continuing to see that move up 18%. Well, again, is very depressing and very concerning when we consider how are we going to get out of this? And it's just we're continuing to see these grind higher. As we talked about Florida and the food pantries and food kitchens running out of food, this is a culmination of where that sits. And now let's take it to the next level. 1 in 4 renters living with children are not caught up on rent. So what happens when we get the expiration of rent of a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures? This is going to be a very big problem because they're going to have to make up rent, which is why if we do get a big stimulus check from Biden, I would assume that this is going to go to rent and food, as it will help try to keep people in place and protected. Now, a quick kind of roundup of what we've talked about when we look at the U3 unemployment rate. You can see kind of where we sit. We peaked at 14.7. We're now at about 6.7%, and you can see where the average is over the last 7 prior recessions. And this is more due to people leaving the workforce, and as they start to come back, that's what I think is going to keep it sticky up at these levels, especially if we get a double dip recession, which I think is very likely, especially in Europe and other areas, just given the problems we continue to see in the market. Now, when we look at job growth, high versus low wage industries, this is coming from Indeed, from the labor statistics. So month over month, lower wages was down 90 basis points. Middle and higher wage was up a little bit. But the change since February, this is where we continue to see job growth shrinking, and the lower wages is down 12%. So how are you going to get people to hire back lower wages if you're increasing the minimum wage? Will that impact how quickly people are willing to spend? And then if you have middle and higher wage earners, will they accept less money to go back to work, which again will shift people from higher wage to middle wage to lower wage. And that's where we have to start to kind of factor in what is going to be the longer term impact to spending in general. And then when we look at, again, this long-term unemployment, you can see the share of unemployed for 27 weeks and over as a percent continues to go higher. About 37% of unemployed individuals have been unemployed for 6 months or more. Again, at what point are you pushed to accept a lower wage salary, a lower wage for a job, and you fall into the underemployment category just to get a job? And that's where we continue to see these pressures, where you can see this shock up, kind of going sideways, and it takes time to come off and work off those issues. And that's why when we look at initial claims, it'll be updated again tomorrow. We've seen some of this movement lower, but 1.1 million new jobless benefit claimants. We're still over 1 million. This is a problem as we go into how are consumers going to feel, how are they going to spend. And then when we look at this under the pandemic, this is where we get our 19.2 million people. But the pandemic unemployment, pandemic emergency, extended benefits, you can see right here that we're right at, call it, 8.3, 8.4, 4.5, almost 1 million. I mean, we're talking about 13, 14 million people that still don't have or are in these benefits. And they were extended, yes, but how many times can we extend them? Because we're already borrowing, we already have these issues, and the consumer is going to continue to struggle based on just some of where these components are. And that's why when we talk about unemployment going from a lagging indicator to a leading indicator, we're seeing it in the leading numbers. Prices are going up, things are better, export numbers are better, new orders are better, but unemployment isn't. And that's where now, if unemployment's not getting better, then we can expect to see this continue, and it'll weigh on wages and spending in general. And with the consumer being 70 to 77% of U.S. GDP, that is a big number that's going to keep pressure on just where these growth numbers and what the expectations are going into the new year. And now that is increasing in Europe as well, which we'll cover in the next segment.